Imagine a world where death arrives without warning, riding the wind and clinging to the shadows. It's the autumn of 1347, and Europe is thriving, booming cities, crowded markets, and faith burning brighter than ever. But on the horizon, 12 Genoese trading ships are sailing toward the port of Messina, Sicily. They look like ordinary vessels returning from the Black Sea, but the men aboard are not ordinary. They are dying. Their bodies are covered in strange black swellings, and their faces are twisted in agony. As the ships dock, panic erupts. The harbor master sees it first, sailors collapsing on the decks, others already dead, their skin mottled with dark, oozing sores. What has followed them across the sea is not a curse from God, it's something far worse. And within days, the city of Messina will be a graveyard. This is the story of how a single disease, invisible and merciless, brought the mightiest civilization of its age to its knees. But to understand the horror that followed, you have to look back. In 1347, Europe was a powder keg of prosperity. The continent had shaken off the famines of the early century, and the population had surged to nearly 80 million people. Trade was booming, with goods flowing from the spice markets of the east through the ports of Italy and into the heart of the continent. Kings were consolidating power, building grand cathedrals, and funding universities. In the cities, streets were packed with merchants, peasants, and pilgrims. It was a world that believed in its own permanence, that trusted God's plan. And yet, beneath this shining surface, lay a fatal vulnerability. Cities were filthy, with raw sewage running through the streets and rats thriving in every corner. The people had no concept of germs, no understanding of hygiene. When a mysterious illness appeared, they had no defense, not in medicine, not in faith, and certainly not in knowledge. Europe was a giant with its eyes closed, waiting for the first blow. Now, let's follow the path of death. It didn't start in Europe. It started in the distant steppes of Central Asia, where a simple flea, no bigger than a grain of rice, carried a bacterium called Yersinia pestis. For centuries, it lurked among wild rodents, harmless to most. But a changing climate and a shifting trade network pushed it into new territory. By 1346, the plague had reached the Black Sea port of Kaffa, a Genoese trading outpost. The city was under siege by the Mongol army, but the siege collapsed when the plague swept through their ranks. In a final, desperate act, the Mongols catapulted the corpses of their own infected soldiers over the city walls. It was an early form of biological warfare, though they didn't know it. The Genoese traders, terrified and disease-ridden, fled. They boarded their ships, unknowingly carrying the seeds of apocalypse in their clothing, their cargo, and their blood. And that is how the Black Death found its ride to Europe. When those 12 ships arrived in Messina, the nightmare became real. The locals rushed to the docks, eager to trade, but what they found made them freeze in terror. The sailors were barely alive, their bodies covered in black boils that wept blood and pus. Some coughed up blood, their faces turning blue from lack of oxygen. Within hours, the port was sealed, but it was too late. The plague had already slipped ashore, hidden in the cargo, in the scurrying rats that fled the ships, and in the very air. The first cases appeared within days. People died in their beds, in the streets, in the middle of their prayers. The sick were abandoned by their families. Priests refused to give last rites. The city's authorities ordered the ships to leave, but the damage was done. Messina became the gateway to hell, and from there, the plague spread like wildfire across Sicily, then to the mainland, then to every corner of Europe. But here's the part that chills you to the bone: nobody knew what was causing it. They called it the Great Mortality, the Pestilence, the Black Death. The name came from the black spots that appeared on the skin, a sign of certain death. Some believed it was God's punishment for their sins, so they whipped themselves in processions, begging for mercy. Others blamed the Jews, poisoning the wells, and thousands were burned alive in horrific pogroms. Physicians could only offer absurd remedies: vinegar, arsenic, even the crushed remains of toads. They wore strange beak masks filled with sweet-smelling herbs, hoping to filter the poisoned air, but they might as well have been wearing nothing at all. The disease moved faster than rumor. It didn't care about your wealth, your rank, or your piety. It struck down the bishop and the beggar alike. And the more it killed, the more the fabric of society began to unravel. What happens when a civilization realizes it has no answer to death? And that's the question that haunts this story. By the time the plague finally burned itself out in the early 1350s, it had erased an estimated 25 million lives, nearly half of Europe's population. It wasn't just a disease, it was a revolution. It shattered the feudal system, gave rise to a new middle class, and shook the foundations of the church. Those who survived inherited a world they no longer recognized. But the real terror isn't just in the numbers, it's in the silence. The silence of empty villages, the silence of abandoned farms, the silence of a church with no one left to ring its bells. And here's what keeps me up at night: the plague didn't disappear. It mutated, it hid, it waited. So when we look at that empty harbor in Messina, we have to ask ourselves, could it happen again? What if the next plague doesn't arrive on a ship, but in the air we breathe, or in a lab we built? What secrets are we still missing about the disease that changed the world? And what if the story of the Black Death is not just a warning from the past, but a prophecy of our future? If you want to uncover the hidden truths behind history's greatest catastrophes, hit subscribe and join us for part 2, where we'll follow the plague's terrifying march into the heart of Europe and meet the man who may have survived it all, only to carry the disease that doomed an empire. The ship that limped into Messina that October day wasn't just carrying cargo, it was carrying death itself. The sailors, barely alive, were covered in black swellings the size of eggs, oozing blood and pus. The people of Messina watched in horror as the crew dropped dead on the dock, their bodies contorting in agony. Within days, the city began to rot from the inside. Families who had welcomed the strangers with open arms were the first to fall. Then it spread to their neighbors. Then to the priests who came to give last rites. And then to the gravediggers who buried them all. The streets, once filled with the noise of merchants and children, fell silent except for the sound of weeping and the constant tolling of funeral bells. Panic set in. Some tried to flee inland, but they carried the invisible passenger with them. Others locked themselves in their homes, but the plague seeped through the cracks. There was no escape. Messina was a trap, and the whole city was caught inside it. But the horror didn't stop at the city gates. The plague was a master of movement, and its favorite ride was the ship. When the Sicilians realized they couldn't bury their dead fast enough, they did the unthinkable: they pushed the rotting corpses into the sea, hoping the tide would carry the curse away. It only carried it farther. Other port cities along the Italian coast, like Reggio and Catania, soon began to report the same gruesome symptoms. By early 1348, the disease had crossed the Strait of Messina and was clawing its way up the boot of Italy. Every harbor became a gateway for death. Every merchant ship a floating tomb. The trade routes that had once made Europe rich now became the arteries of a pandemic, pumping poison from city to city. And the worst part? No one could see it coming. They watched the ships approach with hope, only to realize the cargo they carried was more valuable than gold, and far more deadly. The plague didn't walk. It sailed. And it was coming for everything. Imagine this: it's the year 1348. You're a merchant in the great city of Genoa, a bustling hub of trade and power. You've heard whispers of a terrible sickness in the south, but you dismiss it as rumor, just another story from the superstitious peasants of Sicily. Then the ships arrive. They're not trading vessels full of silk and spices. Their ghost ships, drifting aimlessly into the harbor. When the dock workers board them, they find the crew dead, their faces frozen in horror, their bodies covered in buboes. The cargo? Not gold, not wool, just death. The Genoese try to drive the ships away, firing flaming arrows to burn them at sea. But it's too late. The rats have already swum ashore. The fleas have already found new hosts. And within weeks, Genoa, one of the wealthiest cities in the world, is reduced to a graveyard. The rich flee to their country estates, taking the disease with them. The poor are left to die in the streets. And the great republic, the jewel of the Mediterranean, begins to crumble from within. But here's what the people of Genoa didn't understand, and what we're only now beginning to fully grasp. The plague wasn't just killing people. It was dismantling the entire structure of society. With so many dead, there was no one to harvest the crops. No one to bake the bread. No one to collect the taxes. The feudal system, which had bound peasants to their lords for centuries, began to crack. Workers who survived realized they were suddenly in demand. They could demand higher wages. They could leave their villages and move to cities. They could, for the first time in their lives, choose their own fate. It was a terrifying freedom, born from the most horrifying tragedy imaginable. The old world was dying, and in its place, something new was struggling to be born. But that transformation wasn't peaceful. It was violent, chaotic, and filled with despair. The plague didn't just take lives, it took away certainty. It made people question everything they believed about God, about their rulers, and about themselves. And once that certainty was gone, there was no going back. Now, let's talk about the so-called experts of the age. The physicians. The men who were supposed to have all the answers. They didn't. They were as lost as everyone else. They theorized that the plague was caused by a miasma, a poisonous fog that rose from the earth and infected the air. Some suggested that the alignment of the planets had created a deadly air. Others blamed earthquakes, or the putrid breath of dragons from the east. Their treatments were a macabre lottery. They prescribed bleeding, purging, and sweating. They told people to carry sweet-smelling herbs, to burn aromatic woods, to cover their windows with waxed cloth. Some even recommended sitting in a sewer to avoid the bad air, which, as you can imagine, didn't work out too well. The most famous image of this era is the plague doctor, with his beaked mask filled with vinegar and spices. But that mask was nothing more than a symbol of hope in a time of hopelessness. It didn't stop the disease. It just made the doctor look like a terrifying bird of prey. And that's the cruel irony, the people who were supposed to heal us were just as helpless as the rest of the dying. So where was the plague heading next? Genoa was just the beginning. From there, it would tear through the heart of France, cross into Spain, and eventually make its way to the cold shores of England. But before it did, it left behind a trail of devastation that would forever alter the map of Europe. And here's the question that should terrify you: what if the Black Death wasn't just a one-time event? What if it was a preview of a pattern we're still living through today? Look at how quickly it moved along trade routes. Look at how governments reacted with denial and blame. Look at how the rich fled while the poor died. Does any of this sound familiar? The plague didn't just change the past, it set a template for how humanity responds to catastrophe. And until we learn to break that pattern, we're still prisoners of 1348. So, what if the next plague doesn't need a ship? What if it's already here, waiting for the right moment to strike? And what if the secrets of surviving the Black Death are buried not in history books, but in the genes of the descendants of those who lived through it? That's a story we're going to dig into next time. But before we do you think we're truly prepared for the next great plague, or are we destined to repeat the mistakes of the past? If you want to join us on this journey into the dark heart of history, hit that subscribe button right now. The past is trying to tell us something, and you don't want to miss what it has to say. By early 1348, the plague had become a master of disguise. It didn't just travel by ship anymore. It hitched rides on the hooves of horses, in the wool of sheep, and in the saddlebags of merchants who had no idea they were carrying death itself. The roads of Italy became rivers of poison. And the cities along those rivers? They were traps. Pisa, Florence, Siena, each one a fortress that became a tomb. In Siena, the chronicler Agnolo di Tura would later write that he buried his own 5 children with his own hands. Think about that. A father, digging graves for his own children, because there was no one left to help him. The living were too weak to bury the dead. And the dead were too numerous to count. The plague didn't just kill people. It destroyed the bonds that held society together. Neighbors abandoned neighbors. Parents abandoned children. The priests who gave last rites died before they could finish the prayer. And the bells? The bells that once rang for every death. They fell silent. There were too many deaths to ring the bells for. The silence, in a way, was louder than the screaming ever was. But the plague was not content with Italy. It had a continent to devour. And it found its next path in the caravans of trade that crossed the Alps into France. By summer, it had reached the great papal city of Avignon. This was the seat of the Catholic Church, the spiritual heart of Christendom. And it fell faster than a stone thrown from a catapult. In Avignon, the Pope himself, Clement VI, was forced to quarantine in his chambers, surrounded by blazing fires to purify the air. But even the holiest man in Europe couldn't stop the pestilence. The chronicles say that the river Rhone ran red with the blood of the dead, and that the churchyards were so full they had to consecrate new ground. But here's the detail that chills me to the bone: the Pope's own physician, Guy de Chauliac, wrote that he contracted the plague himself. And he survived. Why? He had no miracle cure. He had no secret weapon. He just kept the boils lanced and prayed. His survival was a lottery ticket that millions of others didn't win. And as Avignon burned, the rest of France watched in horror, knowing that the storm was coming for them next. As the plague marched through Provence, it didn't just kill the body. It killed the mind. People began to believe that the end of the world was at hand. They looked for someone to blame. And they found them. They blamed the Jews. The rumors spread like the disease itself, that Jewish communities had poisoned the wells. It was a lie, a monstrous lie. But in a world gone mad, lies were easier to swallow than the truth that they were all helpless. In Strasbourg, in February 1349, more than 2,000 Jewish men, women, and children were rounded up and burned alive on a wooden platform. The city's leaders did nothing to stop it. Some even encouraged it. They were convinced that by destroying the poisoners, they could save the city. Of course, it didn't work. The plague came to Strasbourg anyway. And it killed Christians and Jews alike, proving that the disease didn't care about your faith, your wealth, or your politics. The massacre was a desperate act of a terrified world. But it also revealed something dark in human nature: when we can't fight the real enemy, we'll create a false one. And that's a lesson that history would repeat, again and again. But the violence wasn't just aimed at outsiders. It turned inward. The flagellants appeared, a terrifying sect of men and women who believed that the only way to appease God's wrath was to punish themselves. They marched from town to town, whipping themselves with leather straps tipped with iron spikes, until their backs were ribbons of blood. They sang hymns of repentance and called on everyone to join them. At first, they were hailed as saviors. Crowds gathered to watch them, to weep with them, to join them. But the flagellants weren't just a religious movement. They were a political weapon. They spread the same lies about the Jews. They incited mobs. They challenged the authority of the church, claiming that they had a direct line to God. The Pope eventually condemned them as heretics. But the damage was done. They had shown that in times of crisis, people would flock to anyone who promised certainty, even if that certainty was built on pain and blood. The flagellants were a sign that the social order was cracking, and the cracks were spreading faster than the plague itself. And then, there were those who didn't want to atone. They just wanted to live. The rich, the powerful, the privileged, they packed their bags and ran. They fled the cities for their country estates, hoping to outrun the invisible enemy. They barricaded their doors, burned their letters, and refused to see anyone. But the plague had a way of finding them. It traveled in the grain they bought, in the servants they hired, in the air itself. No wall could keep it out. No lock could keep it away. And so, the rich died just like the poor, but with one difference: their deaths were observed by a terrified staff, and their bodies were buried in marble tombs that nobody would ever visit. The social contract, the unspoken agreement that held the feudal system together, was dissolving. If the Lord couldn't protect his serfs from the plague, why should the serfs obey the Lord? If the king couldn't stop the dying, why should the people pay taxes? The plague didn't just kill people. It killed the very idea of authority. And when the survivors emerged from the ruins, they would never look at their rulers the same way again. The old world was dying. And something new, something terrifying and full of possibility, was being born in its place. So, where was the plague heading next? Paris. The glittering capital of the Kingdom of France. The largest city in Europe, with over 200,000 souls crammed within its walls. It was a city of kings, scholars, and merchants. It was also a city of filth, poverty, and rats. By the summer of 1348, the plague was at its gates. And this is where our story takes a darker turn. Because the plague didn't just bring death. It brought a crisis of faith. In Paris, the scholars at the University of Paris, the greatest minds of the age, were tasked with explaining the catastrophe. And what did they conclude? That God was punishing humanity for its sins. That the plague was a divine whip, and the only cure was prayer and repentance. But their answer was a lie. It was a lie that protected the church, but it didn't save a single life. And as the plague tore through Paris, the people began to ask a dangerous question: if God is just, why are the innocent dying? If God is merciful, why is he killing us all? They had no answer. And that silence, that terrible silence from heaven, created a wound in the European soul that would never fully heal. The plague didn't just kill a third of Europe. It killed the certainty that the world made sense. And the question it left behind, why do the innocent suffer, would haunt humanity for centuries to come. So, what happens when the faith that held a continent together begins to crumble? And what dark secret will the survivors of Paris uncover in the ruins of their city? That's what we're going to dig into next time. But before we do, if you've made it this far, you've seen how a single disease can shatter the pillars of civilization. The story isn't over. The plague is still spreading. And the decisions made in the next chapter will change the world forever. If you want to see how that story unfolds, hit that subscribe button right now. You won't want to miss what comes next. By the summer of 1348, Paris was a city holding its breath. The streets, once alive with the shouts of merchants and the clatter of carts, had fallen into a sinister quiet. The rich had already fled, leaving behind the poor, the sick, and the forgotten. And then, the plague arrived. It didn't come with trumpets or banners. It came with the tolling of church bells, a sound that would become the city's death knell. In the cramped, filthy quarters of the poor, the disease moved like wildfire. The sick would wake with fever, their bodies covered in black, oozing buboes. They would vomit blood, and their skin would turn a sickly green before death took them. But here's the horror, the rich weren't safe either. They had locked themselves in their mansions, surrounded by fine silks, and the smell of burning herbs meant to purify the air. But the plague didn't care about their wealth. It seeped through the walls, hid in the fabric of their clothes, and rode on the breath of their servants. No amount of gold could buy a cure. No prayer could stop the inevitable. The doctors of Paris, the finest minds in all of Christendom, were helpless. They paraded through the streets in their bird-beaked masks, filled with herbs and spices to ward off the miasma, the poisoned air they believed was the cause of all this death. They bled their patients, they applied poultices of dried toads and arsenic, they even told people to hold a live chicken against their buboes to draw out the poison. Nothing worked. As the death toll climbed into the thousands, the city turned to its greatest authority for an answer, the University of Paris. In June of 1348, the scholars delivered their verdict. Through years of prayer and study, they concluded that the plague was a divine punishment. A fitting scourge sent by God to chastise a sinful humanity. The only cure, they declared, was repentance. But this was a death sentence. It gave people nothing to fight the disease with, only a reason to blame themselves as they watched their children die. It was an answer that protected the Church's power, but it didn't save a single soul. And in the silence that followed, a dangerous thought began to take root. The King of France, Philip VI, was a man who believed in the power of God and the strength of his own crown. But as the plague consumed his capital, he found himself powerless. His own wife, Queen Jean of Burgundy, fell ill in the summer of 1348. The court at the Palais de la Cite, once a place of grand feasts and political intrigue, became a house of whispers and fear. When the queen died, it was as if a dam had broken. Philip, terrified for his own life, fled Paris, leaving his people to fend for themselves. The king's flight was a message heard loud and clear. If the anointed sovereign, the chosen representative of God on earth, could not stand against the plague, then what hope was there for the common man? The divine right of kings, the very foundation of medieval power, began to crack. The people of Paris were not just losing their families. They were losing their faith in the very idea of order. They looked to the heavens and saw nothing but silence. They looked to their leaders and saw nothing but cowardice. And in that void, something terrible and desperate began to stir. But the people couldn't blame the king for long. The pain was too personal. They needed a target they could see, a face they could hate. And they found it. As the plague ravaged the city, a new movement appeared on the streets. Groups of men, stripped to the waist, marched in lines, whipping themselves with spiked leather straps. They were the flagellants. They sang hymns and called for penance, their backs torn and bleeding, their eyes wild with religious frenzy. They claimed that their suffering could atone for the sins of the world and that God would call off the plague if only enough blood was spilled. Their message was simple, brutal, and terrifyingly effective. And as they marched, they pointed their bloody fingers at those they deemed the true source of God's wrath, the Jews. Rumors spread like the plague itself. The Jews were poisoning the wells. They were working with the devil to destroy Christendom. In Paris, the atmosphere became toxic with fear and hatred. The flagellants were not just a religious sect, they were a mob waiting for a spark. The Jewish communities of France watched in terror as the flagellants drew closer. They saw the hatred in their eyes, the violence in their movements. They knew the history. They had seen how other cities had responded to this kind of madness. The accusations of well poisoning were not new, they were an old poison themselves, one that had been used to justify murder for centuries. In the face of this rising tide of fanaticism, the local authorities did nothing. Some were even complicit, seeing a chance to seize Jewish property and cancel their debts to Jewish moneylenders. The church preached tolerance, but its voice was weak against the chorus of panic. The plague was making the world insane. It was turning neighbor against neighbor, brother against brother. And in this madness, the ultimate betrayal was about to take place. The authorities in Paris, desperate to find a scapegoat and appease the mob, began to round up the city's Jewish population. They were herded into wooden buildings, and the doors were locked behind them. The torches were lit. And the screams that followed were lost in the endless tolling of the funeral bells. Burning people alive didn't stop the plague. It never had. The fires of hatred were no match for the fire of the disease. As autumn came to Paris, the bodies piled so high in the streets that the carts could barely move them. The stench of death was so thick it was said you could taste it. The city had become a tomb. And yet, out of this absolute darkness, a single, defiant question began to emerge. If this is God's punishment, why is it killing the most pious? If the only answer is prayer, why do the priests die at the same rate as the thieves? These questions, whispered in the dark corners of the city, were more dangerous than any heresy. They were the seeds of doubt that would eventually grow into the Reformation. But that is still almost 200 years away. Right now, in the charnel house of Paris, all that exists is the present, a present of endless suffering. And as the survivors walk through the streets, past the burning pyres and the abandoned homes, they pass a single, unassuming house. The door is shut. The windows are boarded. But inside, something has been hidden away from the eyes of the city. A secret that will survive the plague. A secret that a few desperate souls will carry with them as they flee the dying capital. Who are these survivors? And what is the nature of the secret they're so desperate to protect? The answer lies in the story of one man, a man who will rise from the ashes of Paris not as a victim, but as a catalyst for unimaginable horror. If you want to uncover the secret they buried before the plague consumed everything, you need to see what happens next. Hit that subscribe button right now, because the next chapter will drag that secret into the light, and it will change everything you thought you knew about the Black Death. While Paris burned with the fires of hatred, a different kind of fire was spreading through the countryside. The flagellants weren't just a mob, they were a movement, a desperate attempt to earn God's mercy through pain. They marched in lines, whips in hand, their backs a canvas of open wounds. Each lash was a prayer, each drop of blood a plea. But their piety was a mask, and underneath it hid a monstrous cruelty. They saw the world in black and white, the pure and the impure, the saved and the damned. And in their judgment, the Jews were the latter. As they moved from town to town, their sermons grew more hateful, their accusations more specific. They spoke of poisoned wells and secret plots. They painted the Jewish people as the architects of this apocalypse. And the starving, terrified peasants listened. They needed an enemy they could see, a target for their rage. The flagellants gave them one. The persecution wasn't random, it was organized. In city after city, the Jewish communities were given an impossible choice: convert or die. Most chose death. In Strasbourg, the entire community of over 2,000 souls was dragged to a massive wooden scaffold built just outside the city walls. The pyre was so large it took hours to consume them all. And what did the authorities do? They watched. They recorded the proceedings. They even collected the debts owed to the Jewish moneylenders, reaping a financial windfall from the ashes. This wasn't just madness, it was greed dressed up as piety. The pattern repeated itself across the Rhineland, in Mainz, in Cologne. Each burning was justified by the same lies, the same wild accusations. And each time, the plague continued to spread, indifferent to the sacrifices made in its name. The killers were learning a terrible lesson, that they could murder with impunity, that the law had died along with its victims. The social fabric of Europe was shredding, not just from the disease, but from the poison of our own fear. But even as the fires of intolerance burned, a strange new phenomenon was taking hold in the hearts of the survivors. A dance. The dance of death, they called it. It began in the streets of the cities, where the living, exhausted by grief and terror, would suddenly break into a wild, frantic dance. It was not a celebration. It was a convulsion, a release of the unbearable pressure of constant death. They would dance until they collapsed, until their bodies were as lifeless as the ones they were dancing to forget. It was as if the plague had broken something fundamental in the human mind, a circuit that controlled reason and restraint. In the midst of this macabre spectacle, artists began to paint their masterpiece, the Danse Macabre. They painted popes and kings, peasants and knights, all dancing hand in hand with grinning skeletons. The message was stark and clear: death is the great equalizer. No one, no matter their power or piety, could escape its grasp. It was a terrifying thought, but in a strange way, it was also a comfort. If death united everyone, then perhaps life should too. This obsession with death didn't just inspire art, it began to reshape the very geography of Europe. With so many villages wiped out, entire towns were simply abandoned, left to rot and crumble. The fields lay fallow, and the forests began to reclaim the land. It was a ghost world. But in the cities, the living were forced to confront the dead in a more direct way. The churchyards were full. The charnel houses were overflowing. The dead were buried in mass graves, layer upon layer, with lime thrown over them to speed up decomposition. In Paris, the great cemetery of the innocents became a horror show. The ground itself seemed to move with the pressure of the bodies below. It was said that the fat from the corpses seeped into the soil, and that the cemetery became so saturated that the ground was greasy to the touch. The smell was beyond description, a physical presence that clung to your clothes and your soul. And yet, this was also the center of the city's social life. People gathered there to trade, to gossip, to meet. They lived with death, danced with it, and were slowly being consumed by it. Yet, even in this city of the dead, a few embers of life refused to be extinguished. Doctors, those who hadn't fled or died, continued to walk the wards, their beaked masks stuffed with herbs to ward off the miasma. They were helpless, but they didn't stop trying. And in their failure, a horrifying truth began to dawn on them. This wasn't a punishment they could pray away. It wasn't a poison they could smell. It was something else, something that passed from the sick to the healthy. They saw it in the swellings, the black buboes that oozed blood and pus. They saw it in the speed of the death. They began to term it pestilence by contact. It was a tiny, terrifying glimmer of the truth. But the church, clinging to its authority, silenced such talk. To suggest a natural cause was to question God's will. And to question God's will was heresy. So the truth was buried, not in the ground, but in the silence of those who knew. The doctors kept their observations to themselves, or whispered them only to their most trusted colleagues. The knowledge was there, a key to survival, but it was locked away by dogma and fear. And so, as the winter of 1348 closed in on Paris, the city held its breath. The plague was still there, lurking in the shadows, claiming its victims one by one. The fires of the burnings had died down, not out of mercy, but because there was almost no one left to burn. But in the heart of this dead city, one man was making a choice that would alter history. He was not a king, not a bishop, not a scholar. He was a physician, a man who had seen too much and could no longer stay silent. He had gathered the scattered notes of his colleagues, their frantic observations, their desperate theories. He had seen the pattern. He knew the plague was not a punishment from God, but a disease spread by touch, by breath, by clothing. He knew the only way to survive was quarantine. But he also knew the church would silence him, maybe even kill him. So, he did the only thing he could. He packed his notes, his forbidden knowledge, into a leather satchel, and he vanished into the night. His name was Guy de Chauliac. And his secret, buried for centuries, is the key to everything that comes next. What did he discover? And how will his forbidden knowledge ignite a war that will tear the church apart? The answer lies in the next chapter. Subscribe now, and I will drag his secret out of the darkness for you. Guy de Chauliac didn't run far. He ran smart. Paris was a tomb, but the road south was a river of the dying and the desperate. He knew that the plague wasn't a divine punishment you could outrun. It was a poison you could smell on a sick man's breath. So he didn't head for the countryside, where the terrified mobs would tear him apart for his knowledge. He headed for the one place where his forbidden ideas might find a powerful, desperate listener. He headed for Avignon. The city on the Rhone was a fortress of faith, but it was also a city under siege. The plague had followed the pilgrims and the merchants there, and the papal palace, the grandest building in Christendom, was now a hospital for the dying. And at its heart, on a bed of silk and gold, lay the Vicar of Christ himself, Pope Clement VI, burning with fever, his body covered in the telltale swellings. Guy knew he had one chance, one audacious, heretical chance, to save the Pope and change history. They called it a miracle. The Pope's personal physician had bled him, purged him, and given him the standard remedies, all to no avail. The Pope was slipping away. That's when Guy de Chauliac, a man with no title and a reputation clouded by his strange theories, stepped forward. He was not a knight or a cardinal. He was a doctor who believed the plague was a poison that traveled from person to person, through the air they breathed and the things they touched. He ordered the Pope's room to be sealed. He had 2 massive fires kept burning day and night, not for warmth, but to purify the air. He draped the Pope in cloth soaked in vinegar and crushed rose petals, a fragrant barrier against the unseen enemy. He isolated Clement from all but a few trusted servants. The cardinals called it madness. The Pope's own physicians called it heresy. But they were powerless. And so, they let the mad doctor have his way. For 8 days, Guy de Chauliac tended to the Pope with the same desperate hope he'd had for every other patient, but with one crucial difference. This time, he had the authority to make everyone listen. The miracle wasn't divine. It was a theory. And it worked. Clement VI didn't die. The fever broke. The swellings, the buboes, they receded and healed. The man who was supposed to be dead was sitting up, eating, and demanding to know how he was still alive. Guy de Chauliac stood before the most powerful man in the world and told him a truth that could get him burned at the stake. He spoke of contagion, of tiny seeds of poison that passed from the sick to the healthy. He spoke of quarantine, of isolating the sick to stop the spread. He didn't mention God's will or divine punishment. He spoke of the physical world, of cause and effect. The Pope listened, his eyes narrow with a mix of fear and intellect. He was a shrewd man, a politician first and a theologian second. He saw the power in Guy's ideas. If the plague was a disease, not a punishment, then the Church wasn't to blame. The Church could position itself as the institution that saves, not the one that condemns. This was a political opportunity. But to use it, he'd have to protect Guy de Chauliac, and in doing so, he'd declare war on the very cardinals who wanted the doctor dead. The Pope's recovery sparked a firestorm. The cardinals, who had been preparing for a conclave to elect a new pope, were furious. They saw Guy de Chauliac not as a savior, but as a threat. His success was an indictment of their own ignorance. They called him a sorcerer, a man who had made a pact with dark forces to save his own skin. They whispered that he had poisoned the Pope only to cure him, to gain his trust and lead the Church into heresy. But Clement was no fool. He knew the politics of his own court. He knew these men would have let him die and then squabbled over his throne. He saw Guy de Chauliac as his most loyal subject. He gave the doctor a title, a position at the papal court, and, most importantly, his ear. Guy was now untouchable. But this new power came with a new kind of danger. He was no longer just a physician. He was a symbol of a new way of thinking, a living challenge to the old order. And there were many, both inside and outside the church, who would do anything to see that challenge silenced forever. Guy knew his position was precarious. He had to prove his worth, to give the Pope something that would cement his place and silence his enemies. He proposed a radical idea. He asked for permission to perform an autopsy. Not on a criminal, but on a victim of the plague. He wanted to open the body and look for the source of the disease. This was blasphemy. The body was a vessel for the soul, and to cut it open was to defile God's creation. The Church had forbidden it for centuries. Guy argued that if the plague was a physical disease, its secrets lay in the physical body. To find it was to find the means to fight it, to save Christendom. It was a gamble. He was betting everything on the Pope's pragmatism. Clement VI, a man who had already defied convention by keeping 2 fires burning in his room, considered the request. He looked at the doctor who had saved his life. He looked at the cardinals who had been ready to bury him. And he made a decision. He granted the permission. He signed a decree that would make Guy de Chauliac the first man in centuries to legally cut open a human body in the name of science. In that moment, the Church didn't just save a life. It had opened a door to a new world, a world where the authority of God was being challenged by the evidence of the eyes. The autopsy was a success. It didn't reveal a cure, but it revealed the truth. The plague was a disease of the blood and the lymph nodes, not a punishment from the heavens. Guy's notes became a weapon, a dangerous knowledge that could shatter the Church's authority. But as he was documenting his findings, a quiet, unassuming cardinal approached him. The cardinal didn't speak of medicine or science. He spoke of a secret. He told Guy that his knowledge was not new, that others had sought it before him and had been silenced. He warned Guy that the forces he was challenging were older and more powerful than any pope. He pressed a small, brittle piece of parchment into Guy's hand. On it was not a medical text, but a single, cryptic symbol, a symbol Guy had never seen before. He asked the cardinal what it meant. The cardinal just shook his head, a look of deep fear in his eyes. "It's the key," he whispered, "the key to a door that should never be opened. And there are those who will kill to keep it shut." Before Guy could ask another question, the cardinal was gone, swallowed by the shadows of the papal palace. Guy de Chauliac had uncovered the secret of the plague. But now, he was holding a secret far more dangerous, a secret that pointed to a conspiracy within the very heart of the Church. What was the symbol? Who were these silent enemies? And what was the door they were so desperate to keep shut? The answers are buried in the dark, and I'm going to dig them up for you. Subscribe now, and I'll lead you through the door. Guy stared at the symbol long after the cardinal had vanished. It was a spiral, but not a simple one. It was a spiral that seemed to twist in on itself, like a snake eating its own tail, yet broken, incomplete. It wasn't a medical symbol. It wasn't a religious one. It was something far older, far more primal. He knew he couldn't ignore it. The plague was his enemy, but this was a different kind of threat. He needed to find out what it meant, and he needed to do it quietly. The cardinal's words echoed in his mind, "There are those who will kill to keep it shut." He couldn't trust anyone, not the Pope, not his fellow physicians, not even the guards outside his door. He was alone with a secret that could burn him alive. So he began his search, not in the halls of power, but in the dusty, forgotten corners of the papal library, where the church kept its most dangerous and forbidden texts. He was looking for a ghost, and he was afraid of what he might find. He spent nights hunched over manuscripts, his eyes burning in the candlelight. He read about ancient Greek physicians, about the humors, about diseases that predated Rome. But the symbol was nowhere to be found. It was as if it didn't exist, as if it had been deliberately scrubbed from history. The more he searched, the more it felt like he was being watched. A shadow would linger at the end of a corridor, a door would creak shut when no one was there. He was getting closer to something, but he was also getting more paranoid. Then, he found it. Tucked behind a loose stone in the wall, a single, leather-bound volume with no title. The pages were filled with a language he didn't recognize, but the illustrations were unmistakable. There it was, the same broken spiral, etched into stone altars, carved into wooden idols. The book spoke of a cult, a pre-Christian sect known as the Custodes, the Keepers. They didn't worship God. They worshipped something buried deep underground, something they believed kept the world safe from a great evil. And they believed that if the spiral was ever completed, that evil would be unleashed. But the book didn't just describe a cult. It described the disease. It spoke of a miasma from the earth, a corruption of the blood that struck down rich and poor alike. It described the swellings, the black blotches, the terrible, agonizing death. The symptoms were identical to the plague ravaging Europe. This wasn't a punishment from God. This was a weapon. A weapon that had been used before, and would be used again. Guy felt a cold dread settle in his stomach. The plague wasn't a natural disaster. It was a release. A release of something that the Custodes had been trying to keep buried for centuries. But who had set it free? And how? He read on, his hands trembling. The book said the keepers guarded a seed of the earth, a source of the corruption, hidden in a place called the Valley of the Shadow. It was a place that didn't appear on any map, a place that existed only in myth. He had to find it. He had to understand what the church was so afraid of. He was so engrossed in his reading that he didn't hear the footsteps behind him until it was too late. A hand clamped down on his shoulder, and a voice, cold and familiar, spoke his name. It wasn't a guard. It wasn't a cardinal. It was a man Guy had seen lurking in the shadows of the Pope's chambers, a man who never spoke, who always seemed to be listening. He was a Monsignor, a bureaucrat of the church, but his eyes held no piety. They held the cold, calculating gaze of a predator. Dr. de Chauliac, the man said, his voice dripping with false courtesy. You seem to have found something interesting. Guy quickly closed the book, but it was too late. The man had seen it. I am merely researching the humors, as the Pope has asked, Guy said, trying to keep his voice steady. The Monsignor smiled, a thin, cruel smile. Of course you are. And I am merely a humble servant of God. But my master is not the Pope. And he is very interested in your work. He leaned in closer, his breath cold on Guy's cheek. You are meddling with forces you do not understand. The plague is a divine punishment. To seek a physical cause is heresy. And heresy has a price. He didn't wait for a response. He simply turned and walked away, his footsteps echoing in the empty library, leaving Guy alone with his fear and a terrible realization. He wasn't just hunting the source of the plague anymore. He was being hunted. Guy knew he had to move quickly. He couldn't stay in Avignon. He couldn't trust anyone. He needed to find the Valley of the Shadow, and he needed to do it before the Monsignor's master found him first. He packed his notes, his medical tools, and the forbidden book, and left the papal palace under the cover of darkness. He didn't know where he was going, only that he had to go east, toward the mountains, toward the unknown. He traveled through the night, through villages emptied by the plague, through fields of rotting crops and unburied dead. The world was dying, and he was a man possessed by a single, desperate mission. He would find the source. He would end the plague. He would prove that the truth was more powerful than fear. But as he crossed a rickety bridge over a fast-flowing river, he saw them. Two riders, silhouetted against the moon, waiting for him on the other side. They didn't move. They didn't speak. They just watched, like vultures circling a wounded animal. Guy tightened his grip on his horse's reins. He had nowhere to run. He had nowhere to hide. He was trapped. And in that moment, he understood the true meaning of the broken spiral. It wasn't just a symbol of an ancient evil. It was a symbol of his own destiny, a destiny he had no control over. The two riders didn't attack. They just sat there, their faces hidden in the shadow of their hoods. One of them raised a hand, not in a threat, but in a gesture of recognition. They knew who he was. They had been waiting for him. Dr. de Chauliac, the rider called out, his voice deep and resonant. We have been expecting you. The custode sent us. We are here to guide you to the valley of the shadow. Guy was stunned. The custodes? They were supposed to be a forgotten cult, a myth. But here they were, in the flesh. Why? Guy asked, his voice barely a whisper. Because the seal is broken, the rider replied. The plague is not a disease. It is a warning. The door is open, and the darkness is spilling out. You are the only one who can close it. You have seen the symbol. You carry the book. You are the one the prophecy spoke of. Guy didn't know what prophecy they were talking about, but he knew he was out of options. He was either a heretic being led to his death, or the last hope of a dying world. He had to choose. He took a deep breath, looked at the riders, and nodded. Lead the way. As they turned their horses east, Guy couldn't shake the feeling that he was walking into a trap. But it was a trap that held the only answers he had left. The mystery of the plague, the conspiracy in the church, the symbol that haunted his dreams, it all led here. To this valley. To this moment. And the question that burned in his mind was, what would he find at the end of the road? A cure for the plague, or the very face of evil itself? The answer would change everything. And you won't want to miss what happens next. The riders didn't speak as they led Guy deeper into the mountains. The trail was narrow, winding through forests that seemed to swallow the moonlight. Every few miles, they passed a village that had been reduced to ash and bone. Guy had seen the plague's work before, but this was different. The bodies weren't just left to rot, they were burned, the houses collapsed on top of them, as if the survivors were trying to erase the very memory of the place. What happened here? He asked, his voice hoarse. The lead rider didn't turn around. The same thing that's happening everywhere, Doctor. But here, they knew it was coming. They tried to burn it out. Guy felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold mountain air. They knew it was coming. That meant the custodes had been here before. They had tried to stop it, and they had failed. He looked at the charred remains of a church, its steeple snapped like a twig, and wondered what kind of evil could make people so terrified that they would destroy their own homes. The road ahead was dark, and Guy had the sinking feeling that the worst was yet to come. They rode for 2 days without rest. On the third morning, the lead rider finally stopped at the edge of a vast, mist-filled valley. The air was still, unnaturally so. No birds sang. No insects buzzed. It was a silence that pressed against Guy's eardrums. The valley of the shadow, the rider said. We go no further. From here, you walk alone. Guy dismounted, his legs weak. He looked at the valley below. It was beautiful in a haunting way, with a river winding through a meadow of pale wildflowers. But there was something wrong, something he couldn't quite place. "What am I looking for?" he asked. The rider pointed to a crumbling stone structure on the valley floor, barely visible through the mist. "The entrance is there. The old monastery of San Galgano. The custodes built it to guard the door. But they're gone now. All of them. You're the last one, Doctor. The last one who knows." Before Guy could ask more, the rider turned his horse and galloped away, disappearing into the trees. Guy was alone. He adjusted his pack, took a deep breath, and began the long descent into the valley. Every step felt heavier than the last, as if the ground itself was trying to keep him away. The monastery of San Galgano was a skeleton of its former self. The roof was gone, and the walls were covered in a thick layer of moss. In the center of the main hall, where the altar once stood, there was a stone circle with strange symbols carved into it. Guy knelt down and traced the symbols with his fingers. They were the same as the one on the parchment, the broken spiral. But here, it was different. It was surrounded by other symbols, forming a complex pattern that seemed to pulse with a life of its own. He realized it wasn't just a map. It was a warning. The spiral wasn't pointing to a location, it was depicting a cycle. A cycle of death and rebirth. A cycle that had happened before. He thought of the burned villages, the mass graves, the terror in people's eyes. It had all happened before, centuries ago, perhaps even millennia. The custodes weren't just guarding a secret, they were guarding a prison. And the prison was breaking. Guy stood up, his heart pounding. If the cycle was repeating, then the key to stopping it wasn't a cure. It was finding out what had stopped it the last time. The answer, he knew, was somewhere beneath his feet. Guy spent hours examining the stone circle, trying to decipher its meaning. He noticed that the symbols weren't just random, they formed a sequence, a pattern that repeated itself in a specific order. It was a language, a very old language that he had never seen before. But there was one symbol he recognized. It was the same symbol that had been branded on the parchment, the broken spiral. But here, it was different. It was inverted. And next to it, there was a small, almost invisible crack in the stone. Guy pulled out his dagger and pried at the crack. The stone moved, revealing a hidden compartment. Inside, there was a leather-bound book, its pages yellowed and brittle. It was older than anything he had ever seen. He carefully opened it. The pages were filled with the same strange symbols, but there were also drawings, detailed illustrations of a city burning, of people dying, of a great darkness rising from the ground. And on the last page, there was a single word, written in Latin. Pandora. Guy felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead. The myth wasn't just a story. It was a warning. The box wasn't just a box. It was a prison. And the plague was just the first thing to escape. Guy was so engrossed in the book that he didn't hear the footsteps until it was too late. The first arrow whistled past his ear, embedding itself in the wall behind him. He dove to the ground, scrambling for cover behind a broken pillar. 3 men in dark armor burst through the monastery doors, swords drawn. The Monsignor's men. They had found him. Guy clutched the book to his chest and ran. He knew the layout of the monastery from the map. There was a crypt below, a network of tunnels that led out to the river. He sprinted down a crumbling staircase, the sounds of pursuit echoing behind him. The air grew colder as he descended. He reached a heavy iron door, rusted and locked. He threw his weight against it, but it wouldn't budge. The men were getting closer. He could hear their heavy breathing, the clink of their armor. He looked at the book in his hands, at the symbol on its cover. With a desperate prayer, he pressed the symbol. There was a loud click, and the door swung open, revealing a pitch-black passage. He didn't hesitate. He stepped through, and the door slammed shut behind him. He was in the dark, alone, with only the book in his racing heart. The passage led deeper than Guy expected. It twisted and turned, descending into the heart of the mountain. The air was stale and heavy, and he had to feel his way along the walls. After what felt like an eternity, he saw a faint light ahead. He emerged into a vast cavern. And what he saw there made his blood run cold. It wasn't a natural cave. It was a city. A city carved into the rock itself, with buildings and streets and towers, all frozen in time. It was the city from the drawings in the book. The city of Pandora. In the center of the city, there was a massive stone door, covered in the same symbols as the floor above. And the door was slightly ajar. A cold, malevolent draft seeped through the crack. Guy took a step forward. This was it. The source. The answer to everything. But as he raised his hand to touch the door, he heard a voice behind him. A voice he recognized. "Well done, Doctor. You found it. Now, step aside. This is where your journey ends." Guy turned around. The Monsignor's master stood there, a sinister smile on his face. He had been following Guy all along. And he had brought an army. Guy de Chauliac stood frozen, the Monsignor's master and his armored soldiers filling the cavern behind him. The ancient city of Pandora stretched out before them, a silent testament to a forgotten age. But there was no time for awe. The man who had orchestrated everything, the manipulation, the pursuit, the murders, was now demanding the prize. Guy's mind raced. He had the book, the key to the door. But what lay beyond it? The cold draft whispering through the crack promised something terrible. He looked at the massive stone door, covered in symbols that matched the ones in his book. He knew he couldn't fight. He couldn't outrun them. But he could make a choice. With a surge of defiance, he turned and pressed the symbol on the book's cover against the door. The ground shook. The soldiers stumbled. The door began to slide open, revealing a darkness so absolute it seemed to swallow the torchlight. And from that darkness, a sound emerged, a low, guttural hiss that made every hair on his body stand on end. The hiss grew into a deafening roar, a sound like 1,000 serpents awakening from 1,000-year slumber. The soldiers, brave men hardened by war, hesitated. The Monsignor's master shouted orders, but his voice was drowned out by the chaos. A wave of putrid air, thick with the stench of decay and something else, something ancient and unnatural, rushed out of the open doorway. Guy shielded his face, his eyes watering. When he looked up, he saw them. Dozens of pairs of eyes, glowing a sickly yellow, emerging from the darkness. The shapes were vaguely human, but wrong. Their limbs were too long, their movements too fluid, like predators stalking prey. They weren't just the source of the plague. They were its guardians. The first creature lunged, and the cavern erupted into a nightmare of screams and clashing steel. In the pandemonium, Guy ran. Not back the way he came, but forward, into the city of Pandora. He ducked into a narrow alleyway between two stone buildings, his heart pounding. He could hear the battle raging behind him, the cries of dying men. The Monsignor's master had wanted the source. Now he had found it. And it was far more than he had bargained for. Guy ran through the labyrinthine streets of the dead city, the sounds of the massacre slowly fading behind him. The architecture was alien, with sharp angles and unsettling geometries that seemed to defy logic. Every shadow seemed to move, every corner hid a threat. He clutched the book, its cover now warm to the touch. He knew he needed to find a way out, but the map in the book only showed the entrance. He was lost. He stopped to catch his breath, leaning against a cold stone wall. That's when he saw it. A faint, ethereal blue light emanating from a building that looked different from the others. It was circular, with no visible entrance, and covered in intricate carvings that seemed to depict a great battle. As he approached, the light intensified. He felt a pull, a strange attraction that was both terrifying and irresistible. He circled the building, looking for a way in. There was none. But on the side facing him, the carvings seemed to shift and rearrange themselves, forming a pattern he recognized. It was the symbol from the book. The broken spiral. He placed his hand on it. The stone was cold, but he felt a vibration, like a heartbeat deep within the earth. The ground beneath his feet began to tremble. A section of the circular wall slid open, revealing a chamber bathed in an eerie blue luminescence. Guy stepped inside, his breath catching in his throat. The room was filled with shelves upon shelves of scrolls and books, but they weren't like any he had ever seen. The covers were made of a strange, dark metal, and the pages seemed to be made of a material that shimmered like the scales of a fish. In the center of the room stood a pedestal, and on it rested a single, open book. Its pages glowed with the same blue light. Guy approached it cautiously. As he drew near, the symbols on the pages began to shift and change, forming words he could actually read. The plague is a doorway. The doorway is a key. The key is the blood of the fallen. The words chilled him to the bone. He read on, his eyes scanning the metallic pages. It wasn't a history. It was a warning. A warning about what lay beyond the door he had opened. And a warning about the man who had been following him. The book predicted his arrival, and it predicted a choice. A choice that would determine the fate of not just Europe, but the entire world. Guy was so engrossed in the glowing pages that he didn't hear the footsteps behind him until it was too late. "Impressive, isn't it?" a voice echoed through the chamber. He spun around. The Monsignor's master stood at the entrance, his armor splattered with blood, his sword drawn. Behind him, a handful of his soldiers remained, their eyes wide with a mixture of fear and awe. "You led me right to it, Doctor." The final piece of the puzzle. Guy stood his ground, clutching the book. "You don't know what you're dealing with," he said, his voice trembling. "This isn't a weapon. It's a warning." The master laughed, a cold, hollow sound. "Warnings are for the weak. I see an opportunity." He gestured to his soldiers, who began to advance. Guy looked at the open book on the pedestal, then at the one in his hands. The words were still burning in his mind. The key is the blood of the fallen. He understood now. The man didn't want to stop the plague. He wanted to control it. To use it as a weapon. Guy knew he had to stop him, but he was outnumbered, unarmed, and trapped. He had one chance. One desperate, insane chance. He looked at the pedestal and made a decision that would change everything. Guy lunged for the pedestal, knocking the glowing book to the floor. As it hit the ground, a shockwave of blue energy erupted from it, throwing the soldiers backward. The Monsignor's master staggered, his sword flying from his hand. The chamber shook violently. Cracks appeared in the walls, and chunks of stone began to fall from the ceiling. Guy scrambled to his feet, grabbing the fallen book. He had to get out. He ran for the entrance, but the master was already on his feet, blocking his path. "You fool! You've doomed us all," the master snarled, drawing a dagger. Guy didn't hesitate. He threw the heavy metal book at him. It struck the master in the chest, sending him sprawling. Guy sprinted past him, out of the chamber, into the shaking city. The ground was splitting open. The ancient structures were crumbling. And from the massive door he had opened, the hissing was growing louder again. The creatures were returning. Guy ran, not knowing where he was going, only knowing he had to survive. He had the book. He had the warning. And he had a new mission. He had to get back to the surface and tell the world what he had seen. But first, he had to escape the city of Pandora, and whatever was unleashed along with it. The fate of Europe now rested on his shoulders alone. He burst through a crack in a crumbling wall and found himself back in the original cavern. The stone door he had opened was now spewing a thick, black smoke, and the air was filled with the sound of inhuman shrieks. The soldiers who had survived the initial attack were fleeing, their discipline shattered. Guy joined the chaos, scrambling up the passage he had come down. The tunnels were shaking, threatening to collapse at any moment. He ran, ignoring the burning in his lungs, the ache in his legs. He thought of the book, the warning, the Monsignor's master. He thought of the plague that was ravaging Europe, and the truth he now held. He emerged into the abandoned monastery, the cool night air a shock to his system. He didn't stop. He kept running, past the bodies of the fallen, out into the forest. He ran until he could run no more, collapsing against a tree, gasping for breath. He looked back. The mountain stood silent, but he knew what was hidden beneath it. He clutched the metal book to his chest. This was far from over. What was the true purpose of the plague? Was it a natural disaster, or a weapon from a forgotten age? And what was his role in the coming storm? The answer, he feared, was just beginning to unfold. Guy knew he couldn't stay in the open. The Monsignor's master might have survived. His men might still be searching. He had to find shelter, and he had to find answers. The book in his hands was older than any civilization he knew. It spoke of a doorway and a key. It spoke of a plague that was not a disease but a mechanism. He recalled the words, "The plague is a doorway. The doorway is a key. The key is the blood of the fallen." What did it mean? Was the plague itself a door to something? He thought of the creatures in the cavern. They were the guardians, or the inhabitants, of whatever was behind the door. He felt a chilling certainty, the plague was not the end. It was just the beginning. He had to find someone who could help him understand. He thought of the Pope, of the cardinals, of the scholars at the University of Paris. But he trusted none of them. He was utterly alone, the sole keeper of a secret that could shatter the foundations of his world. He looked towards the distant lights of a village. He would have to go back into the world. But he would go back changed. The doctor who had sought to cure a disease was now the guardian of a truth far more dangerous. Who could he possibly trust? The forest was a blur of shadow and terror. Guy ran until his lungs burned, until the sounds of the collapsing mountain were just a memory. He finally stopped, collapsing against a gnarled oak, the metal book pressed against his chest. The words from the ancient text echoed in his mind, "The plague is a doorway. The doorway is a key. The key is the blood of the fallen." He stared at the book, its cover cold and unyielding. This wasn't a medical treatise. It was a weapon, or a map to one. He was a doctor, a healer. Now, he was a fugitive carrying a secret that could condemn him as a heretic. He had to move. He couldn't risk the Monsignor's master sending more men. He looked to the west, towards the setting sun, and knew his journey was only just beginning. Days turned into a blur of back roads and frightened whispers. Guy avoided the main roads, traveling as a simple pilgrim. He heard the news in fragments. The plague was now in England, in Spain. The world was dying. But he also heard a new, more troubling story. Groups of flagellants were marching through the countryside, whipping themselves into a frenzy. They preached that the end of the world was here, and they were gathering followers, blaming the sins of the people. Guy saw them from a distance, a column of chanting, bleeding figures. They were a different kind of plague, a plague of fear and fanaticism. He clutched his book tighter. If they ever learned what he knew, they would tear him apart. He had to get to a city, somewhere he could lose himself, and find someone who could help him decipher the book's secrets. Guy finally reached the outskirts of Marseille. The city was a hive of desperation. The streets were lined with the dead and the dying. He kept his head down, his face hidden beneath a hood. He needed a plan. He couldn't just walk up to the university and ask for help. He was a wanted man, or he might be. He found shelter in a rundown inn near the docks, a place where no one asked questions. He rented a small room and locked the door. He placed the metal book on the table, its strange glyphs seeming to glow in the candlelight. He had to understand it. He traced the symbols with his finger. They were not Latin, not Greek. They were something far more ancient. He fell asleep with the book open, its secrets still locked away, and his dreams were filled with the shrieks of the creatures in the cavern. A knock at the door shattered his sleep. Guy jumped up, his hand going to the dagger at his belt. The knock came again. "Traveler," a voice whispered. "I saw you come in. I have information that could save your life." Guy hesitated. It could be a trap. But the voice was not hostile. He opened the door a crack. A woman stood there, her face half hidden by a shawl. She was young, with sharp, intelligent eyes. "You are Guy de Chauliac, the Pope's physician," she said. It wasn't a question. "My name is Alex. I was a student of medicine in Montpellier. I know what you are carrying. I know about the book. And I know about the custodes." Guy felt a chill run down his spine. How could she know? "You need help," she said. "And I need the truth. The plague is not what they say it is. It's something else. And I think you're the only man in Europe who knows what." Guy let her in, his mind racing. Alex was smart, too smart to be a simple peasant. She told him she had been studying the plague's patterns for months, collecting reports from sailors and merchants. She had noticed that the disease seemed to follow the old trade routes, but also something else. "It's not just moving," she said. "It's spreading outwards from certain points. As if it's searching for something." Guy listened, his heart pounding. Her observations matched the clues in the book. "There's a pattern," she continued, pulling a map from her bag. "A map of the outbreaks. Look." She pointed to a cluster of dots. "They form a shape. A spiral." Guy stared at the map. It was the same broken spiral from the book. "What does it mean?" he whispered. Alex looked at him, her eyes wide. "I think it's a message. A countdown. The plague isn't just a disease. It's a signal. And I think it's almost finished what it started." The realization hit Guy like a physical blow. The plague was a mechanism, and it was nearly complete. "Find the center," he said, his voice hoarse. Alex traced the spiral on the map. Her finger stopped in the mountains of Eastern Europe. "Here," she said. "This is where it all started. And this is where it will end." But what was there? The answer was in the book. Guy opened it, and the pages felt different. The glyphs seemed to shift, forming a picture. A city, not the one he had seen, but another. A city of towers, built into a mountain peak. "I saw this place," he whispered. "In the book. It's not just a city. It's a fortress. A final door." He looked at Alex. The plague isn't the weapon. It's the key that opens the door. And when it's finished, the real horror will be unleashed. He knew then that they had to stop it. They had to find the center of the spiral before it was too late. Guy and Alex pored over the map and the book, piecing together the truth. The plague was a two-stage weapon. First, it weakened the world, killing millions and shattering society. Second, it was a locator, a signal that, when its spread was complete, would trigger something at the center. But who would create such a thing? Alex asked, her voice trembling. And why? Guy thought of the custodes, the ancient guardians. They were not guarding against the plague. They were guarding the door. But the Monsignor's master had wanted to use it. He wanted to open the door. We're running out of time, Guy said, looking at the map. The plague is almost done spreading. We need to get to the center of the spiral. It was a journey of hundreds of miles, through the most plague-ravaged lands of Europe. A journey that would take them through the heart of the death. We go now, he said. But we go alone. We can't trust anyone. We're the only ones who know the truth, and we're the only ones who can stop it. They slipped out of Marseille before dawn, 2 more shadows in a dying world. Guy led the way, his hand never straying far from the book hidden in his tunic. The journey east was a waking nightmare. They passed through villages where the only sound was the buzzing of flies and the cawing of crows. They saw the mass graves, the burning houses, the desperate faces of the survivors. Guy felt a profound sense of guilt. He was carrying the reason for all this death, and he could not share it. He was the only one who could stop it, but he was also the reason it had been allowed to happen. Alex walked beside him, silent and determined. They had a goal. A destination. A final reckoning. The spiral was closing, and they were being pulled towards its center. The question was, what would they find there? A door to salvation, or the final, terrifying truth of the Tsaichet den? And as the mountains of the east loomed on the horizon, Guy knew that the answer was coming, faster than either of them could have imagined. For days they traveled, sleeping in barns and abandoned huts, always moving east. The plague seemed to be receding here, but the land was still scarred. One evening, they came upon a small village that had been spared the worst of it. The villagers were suspicious, but they offered food and shelter. As they ate, Guy overheard a conversation. A group of men were talking about a strange valley in the mountains, a place the locals called the Devil's Anvil. They said no one who entered ever came back. There are stories of lights in the mountains at night, one man said. And sounds. Like something huge, moving underground. Guy and Alex exchanged a glance. This was it. The center of the spiral. The place the book had shown him. They had found the door. Now they had to find a way to open it, or to make sure it was never opened again. They left the village at first light, heading towards the mountains. The path was steep and treacherous, little more than a goat trail. The air grew thin and cold. As they climbed higher, Guy felt a growing sense of dread. This was the place. The book had shown him a city of towers, but here there was only bare rock. It's hidden, Alex said, as if reading his thoughts. The city is hidden. The door is hidden. They spent the day searching the mountainside, finding nothing. As the sun began to set, Guy noticed something strange. A section of the rock face seemed to be unnaturally smooth. He walked towards it, his heart pounding. There were faint markings on the stone, almost worn away by time. He pulled out the book and held it up. The glyphs on the cover seemed to resonate with the markings on the rock. The stone began to groan. A massive, hidden door was beginning to open. The final door. The center of the spiral. They had found it. The stone door slid aside, revealing a dark passage that descended into the heart of the mountain. A cold, stale air rushed out, carrying the faint scent of decay. Guy hesitated. This was the point of no return. He looked at Alex. She nodded, her face pale but determined. They were in this together. They stepped into the darkness, the only light coming from the torch Guy had prepared. The passage was long and narrow, with walls covered in the same strange glyphs as the book. The air grew heavier, more oppressive. They walked for what felt like an hour, the silence broken only by the sound of their footsteps. Finally, the passage opened up into a vast cavern. And in the center of the cavern, bathed in an eerie, unnatural green light, was a structure that made Guy's blood run cold. It was not a city. It was a machine. A massive, complex mechanism of black stone and metal, humming with a malevolent energy. The center of the spiral. The key. The last door. And it was awake. As they approached the machine, Guy could see that it was covered in intricate carvings, depicting scenes of death and rebirth. At its center was a large, circular indentation, the exact shape and size of the metal book. "It's a lock," Alex whispered. "The book is the key." Guy looked at the book in his hands. He had carried it from the city of Pandora, from the heart of the fallen civilization. He was the key holder. He was the one who had to decide. Insert the book, and the machine would activate, unleashing the full power of the plague or something even worse. Or destroy the book, and perhaps stop it forever. But he had to be sure. He read the ancient text again, "The key is the blood of the fallen." He looked at Alex. "It's not the book," he said. "It's the blood. The book is just a container. It's a vessel for the blood of the custodes. The blood of the guardians." He realized the truth. The plague was a mechanism to gather the blood of millions. But the final key was something else. It was a sacrifice. The blood of the one who knew the truth. The blood of the last guardian. His blood. Guy stood at the precipice of a decision that would define not just his life, but the fate of the world. He understood now. The plague was a two-part key. The first part was the mass death, which powered the machine. The second part was the blood of a custodes, the blood of one who knew the truth, to open the final lock. He was the last of his line, the last to carry the secret. He was the blood of the fallen. He looked at Alex. "You have to leave," he said. "This is my burden." She shook her head. "No. We face this together." He looked at the machine, at the indentation waiting for its key. He could insert the book and see what happened. Or he could destroy it, and the machine would remain dormant. But the plague was still out there. The plague was still killing millions. It wouldn't stop until the machine was activated or destroyed. He raised the book, ready to bring it down on the stone floor. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "For all of us." And then, before he could act, the cavern was filled with a blinding light, and a voice boomed from the machine, "You are too late." The light didn't just blind, it burned. It felt like the sun itself had been dragged down into this pit of ancient stone and death. My hands flew to my face, but the image was already seared into my mind, the machine, the carvings, the indentation, all of it was shifting, writhing like a living thing. And that voice. It wasn't a sound you heard, it was a pressure you felt in your bones, a vibration that rattled the teeth in your skull. "You are too late." The words echoed, not through the cavern, but through my very being. Alex was beside me, her hand gripping my arm, her face pale as bone. The voice wasn't a threat. It was a statement of fact. We hadn't stumbled onto a lock, we'd walked into a trap. And the jaws were just starting to close. The voice wasn't a person. It was a thing, a force that had been sleeping in this machine for longer than our civilization had existed. The harvest is complete, it thundered. The gate opens. The ground beneath our feet began to tremble. Cracks spiderwebbed across the stone floor, and the carvings on the machine started to glow brighter, pulsing with an energy that felt malevolent and hungry. Alex pulled me back. "It's not a weapon, Guy. It's a beacon," she screamed over the rising din. A beacon. The book wasn't a key, it was a switch. The plague wasn't the weapon, it was the power source. And we had just stood in the middle of its ignition sequence. The machine began to turn, a low groan of stone on stone, and the light intensified, carving a path upwards, towards the surface, towards the sky. It was calling something. Or waking something up. We ran. Not with the courage of heroes, but with the blind panic of prey. Behind us, the machine was roaring, a sound like 1,000 waterfalls reversed. The light was no longer a beam, it was a pillar, a column of fire that was boring its way through the earth's crust. The entire cavern was shaking, and massive chunks of rock were beginning to fall from the ceiling. Alex was ahead of me, her scholarly composure gone, replaced by the raw instinct of survival. She knew the way out, we had mapped it on our way in. But the path was collapsing. A pillar of stone crashed down between us, separating us for a terrifying moment. "Guy! This way," she yelled, her voice barely audible. I scrambled over the rubble, my robes torn, my hands bleeding. I could feel the heat of the light on my back, and I knew, with a sickening certainty, that if we didn't reach the surface, we would be buried alive in this tomb of our own making. We burst out of the hillside just as the ground behind us gave way with a final, deafening groan. We collapsed onto the grass, gasping for air, our lungs burning. For a moment, there was only silence, broken by the sound of our own ragged breaths. Then, Alex pointed. Below us, in the distance, the lights of Marseille flickered and then, went out. One by one, as if an unseen hand was snuffing out candles. And then, a different light began to rise, an orange, flickering glow that painted the clouds red. "Oh, God," I whispered. The city was burning. The voice from the machine had said it was too late. It hadn't been talking about the ritual in the cave. It had been talking about this. The cleanse had already begun. The beacon in the cavern wasn't just a call, it was a final instruction. And somewhere, in that burning city, its servants were already carrying it out. I fell to my knees, the weight of it all pressing down on me. We had been played. The ancient book, the city of Pandora, the key, it was all a lure, a magnificent distraction to pull the last guardian away from his post. The machine wasn't the final lock, it was a decoy. The real mechanism, the one that truly mattered, was out here, in the world of men, and it was already in motion. The voice had said the harvest was complete. But the harvest of what? Of death? Of souls? Alex knelt beside me, her face grim. "It's not about the machine, is it?" she said, more to herself than to me. "The machine was the trigger. But the lock is a person." I looked at her, the pieces finally falling into place. The plague wasn't the end goal. It was the fuel. And the final key, the one that would seal our doom, wasn't made of metal or stone. It was alive. "We have to find them," I said, my voice hoarse. "We have to find the soul before they do." The road back to Avignon was a path through hell. Every village we passed was a silent graveyard. The plague was no longer a creeping horror, it was a raging inferno, consuming everything in its path, and we had just learned it was being orchestrated. The cleanse the machine spoke of wasn't just about death, it was about ending a cycle that had repeated for millennia. And the soul we had to find was the one person who could stand in its way. I had thought the fight was against a disease. Then it was against a conspiracy. Now, I knew it was against something ancient and patient, something that had seen empires rise and fall. As the walls of Avignon appeared on the horizon, I felt a cold, familiar dread. This was where it all began. This was where I had served a pope, where I had held the secrets of the church. And now, it was where I might find the last piece of the puzzle. But I had to ask myself a terrifying question: was I leading us to the answer, or into the heart of the trap? There's only one way to find out. But you're not going to want to miss what we find behind those walls. So hit that subscribe button, and make sure you're here for the next chapter, because the greatest secret of the plague is about to be revealed, and it's not what you think. The walls of Avignon rose before us, not as a sanctuary, but as a mausoleum. The city that once buzzed with the whispers of cardinals and the clink of gold was now a fortress of fear. The streets were empty, save for the carts piled high with the dead, their wooden wheels groaning under the weight of silence. We entered through a postern gate, using the old routes I knew from my years in the papal palace. Alex's hand was on her dagger, her eyes scanning every shadow. We were not just returning to the heart of Christendom, we were walking back into the spider's web. The Monsignor's influence was everywhere, in the guarded glances, in the sealed windows, in the very air that smelled of incense and decay. I knew we couldn't trust anyone, not even the priests who muttered their prayers to empty pews. The game had changed. We were no longer uncovering a secret, we were trying to stop a countdown. And somewhere in this city of gold and God, the key to it all was waiting, unaware of the role they were destined to play. We found shelter in a dilapidated inn near the Rhone, a place where the innkeeper was too drunk to notice who came and went. The city was a powder keg of paranoia. Rumors flew faster than the plague itself, the flagellants were growing bolder, the Jews were being blamed for poisoning wells, and the papal court was in a state of chaos. But we were after a different kind of rumor. We needed to find who in the church had the power to move the pieces on this board. Alex had a contact, a scribe who copied letters for the cardinals. The price for his information was steep, but the secret he sold us was worth it. A secret meeting was to take place in 3 days, deep beneath the Palais des Papes, in a chapel that had been sealed off for decades. All the major players would be there, including the Monsignor. The question was, what were they planning? The answer, I feared, would not just reveal the identity of the soul, but the final move in this cosmic game of chess. We had to get into that meeting, even if it meant walking straight into the lion's den. 3 days. We had 3 days to find a way into a fortress within a fortress. The Palais des Papes was a maze of corridors, chapels, and secret passages. I knew many of them from my time as the Pope's physician, but the Monsignor had been busy. The old routes were guarded, and new ones were booby-trapped. We had to find another way. Alex was a genius with locks and mechanisms. She spent hours studying the plans of the palace that I had committed to memory, tracing the waterways that ran beneath it. An old sewer line, long forgotten, connected to the crypt of the sealed chapel. It was a risk. A flood, a collapse, or a patrol could mean our deaths. But it was the only way. As we prepared our gear, dark cloaks, a lantern, a crowbar, and my surgical kit, which I prayed I wouldn't need, I felt the weight of our mission. We were 2 people against an ancient power and a corrupt church. The odds were laughable. But as I looked at Alex, her face set in grim determination, I knew we had no choice. The world was dying, and we were the only ones who could stop the one pulling the strings. The stench of the sewer was overwhelming, a foul mixture of human waste, rotting refuse, and the ever-present miasma of death. We waded through the dark, the water up to our waists, our only light a single shuttered lantern. Every sound echoed, every drip seemed like a thunderclap. The walls of the ancient Roman sewer were slick with slime, and the air was thick and suffocating. We moved slowly, deliberately, our feet finding purchase on the slippery stone. This wasn't the grand entrance I had envisioned. This was desperation. After what felt like an eternity, we reached a junction. According to my memory, the crypt should be to the left. But the passage was blocked by a collapse. My heart sank. We had come all this way for nothing. But Alex, ever resourceful, noticed a small grate in the floor, half hidden by debris. It led to a smaller, older drain. It was a tight fit, barely wide enough for a man's shoulders. We had no choice. I went first, my body scraping against the rough stone, my breath held as I squeezed through the narrow passage. The darkness pressed in on me, and for a moment, I felt a primal panic rise in my throat. Then, I saw a faint glow ahead. The floor of the crypt. We had made it. We emerged into the crypt like phantoms, our cloaks dripping with filth. The chapel above was silent, but we could hear the muffled drone of voices. We had arrived just in time. Through a crack in the ancient door, we could see the meeting. The Monsignor stood at the head of a long table, his face illuminated by the flickering candles. Around him were the most powerful men in Christendom, cardinals, bishops, and a few men I didn't recognize, their attire suggesting they were from the East. They were not discussing the plague as a divine punishment. They were discussing it as a business transaction. "The harvest is complete," the Monsignor said, his voice cold and detached. "The final phase requires the key. We have located the bloodline. The last heir is here, in Avignon, serving in the papal court." My blood ran cold. A bloodline? Not a soul, but a lineage. The pieces of the Guardian's riddle finally clicked into place. The soul was not a single person, but a family line, carrying a specific trait, a genetic key that was needed to complete the ritual. And the last of this line was someone I knew. Someone I had served with, healed, and trusted. The Monsignor smiled. "Find them," he ordered. "Find the last descendant of the custodes, and bring them to me." The name hit me like a physical blow. The descendant was a young scribe I had mentored years ago, a quiet, earnest boy named Thomas. He was kind, devout, and hopelessly naive. He had no idea of his heritage, no idea that his bloodline was the key to the end of the world. The Monsignor's men were already moving, their orders clear. We had to reach him first. We burst from the crypt, our cover blown, the alarm bells starting to ring throughout the palace. We ran through the winding corridors, past startled priests and guards, our only advantage being the element of surprise. But the Monsignor's men were fast, and they were everywhere. We fought our way through, a desperate, brutal ballet of steel and prayers. We found Thomas in his quarters, his face a mask of confusion and terror. There was no time to explain. We grabbed him and ran, the sound of pursuit growing ever closer. We were outnumbered, outmaneuvered, and on our own. The church, the very institution I had served, was now our hunter. And the only thing that stood between us and the abyss was a boy who didn't understand why his life was worth so much. The race for the final key had begun. And the clock was ticking. You don't want to miss what happens next. The secret of Thomas's bloodline, and the Guardian's final move, are about to be revealed. So hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because the next chapter of this story will change everything you think you know about the plague. We tore through the palace corridors, Thomas's hand clenched in mine. Behind us, the clatter of armored boots echoed like a death knell. The Monsignor's men were relentless, their shouts bouncing off the ancient stone. We burst into the kitchens, scattering servants and sending pots clattering. A dead end. A wall of ovens stared back at us. Alex's eyes darted, calculating. "The wine cellar," she breathed, pointing to a trapdoor beneath a sack of flour. We threw it open, the damp, earthy smell of rotting grapes hitting us. We descended into the blackness, pulling the door shut above us just as the first guard entered the kitchen. We pressed ourselves against the cold stone walls, holding our breath. The heavy footsteps thundered above, then faded. Thomas was trembling, his face pale in the faint light. "Why are they after me?" he whispered. I could only shake my head. How could I tell him that his very blood was a weapon? That his ancestors had guarded a secret so terrible it could unmake the world? We had to move. The cellar would not hide us for long. The cellar stretched deeper than I remembered, a labyrinth of forgotten vintages and spiderwebs. We moved by touch, feeling our way along the rough-hewn walls. Alex found a rusted grate, an old service exit leading to the outer courtyard. I pried it open with my dagger, the metal groaning in protest. We slipped out into the night, the cool air a shock after the stale cellar. The courtyard was eerily quiet, save for the distant clamor of the palace. Fires were being lit on the battlements, they knew we were gone. We skirted the shadows, keeping to the walls, our cloaks blending with the darkness. Thomas stumbled, and I caught him. In that moment, I saw his face clearly. He was just a boy, caught in a war he didn't understand, carrying a destiny he never asked for. I made a silent vow. I would protect him, no matter the cost. Not because he was the key, but because he was innocent. We reached the stables, the smell of hay and horse manure thick in the air. A single horse, a sturdy palfrey, was still saddled. It was our only chance. We rode hard, the palfrey straining under the weight of 3. Thomas sat in front of me, his small body rigid with fear. Behind us, Avignon glowed orange, a beacon of the power we had just defied. We didn't stop until the dawn broke, painting the sky in hues of pink and gold. We found shelter in an abandoned shepherd's hut, its roof half collapsed, but it offered a modicum of safety. Alex scouted the area while I tended to Thomas. He was exhausted, his spirit broken. "What am I?" he asked, his voice small. I knelt before him, looking into his eyes. "You are a descendant of the custodes," I said, the words heavy with meaning. "Your ancestors were guardians, protectors of a secret that keeps our world from being devoured by an ancient evil. And now, that evil has found a way to use your blood to finish what it started." He didn't fully understand, but he saw the gravity in my eyes. He nodded, a silent acceptance of his burden. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt a sliver of hope. But that hope was short-lived. The sound of hoofbeats shattered the morning calm. Alex burst through the door, her face ashen. "They found us," she said, her voice tight. "A dozen of them, maybe more. We had no time to run." I grabbed Thomas and pushed him behind me, drawing my sword. Alex stood beside me, her crossbow loaded. The riders surrounded the hut, their armor glinting in the morning sun. The Monsignor himself dismounted, his face a mask of cold fury. "You have something that belongs to the church, Doctor," he said, his voice dripping with venom. "You can't have him," I said, my voice steady. "He's not a thing to be owned." The Monsignor laughed, a hollow, cruel sound. "Everything is a thing to be owned, when you have the power to take it." With a flick of his wrist, his men advanced. We fought. It was a desperate, savage struggle. I parried a sword thrust, kicked a guard in the chest. Alex's crossbow sang, felling 2 men. But they kept coming, like a tide of steel. One of them grabbed Thomas. He cried out, his eyes filled with terror. I lunged, but a heavy blow to my head sent me reeling. The world spun, and I fell to my knees, tasting blood. Darkness. Then, a faint, rhythmic chanting. I opened my eyes to find myself bound in a cold, stone chamber. The Monsignor stood before me, a candle in his hand. "You see, doctor," he said, "your interference was a minor inconvenience. The boy is ours. The ritual will be completed." I strained against my bonds. "What ritual? What are you really doing?" The Monsignor smiled, a sickeningly pious expression. "We are not ending the world, doctor. We are saving it. The plague is a pruning, a necessary culling to prepare the way for a new age. The bloodline of the custodes is the only thing that can control it, and with it, we will shape that new age. We will become the architects of a new Eden." The pieces finally fell into place. The Monsignor didn't want to unleash the entity. He wanted to control it. To use its power to achieve a godlike authority. "You're mad," I spat. "Perhaps," he said, "but I am also sane enough to know that this world needs a firm hand. And I intend to be that hand." He turned to leave. "You will watch, doctor. You will watch the boy become the key, and you will know that you failed." But the Monsignor had underestimated one thing, Alex. She had been captured too, but her captors had been careless. I heard a scuffle outside the door, then a thud. The lock clicked, and the door swung open. Alex stood there, a bloody dagger in her hand. "We have to move," she said, her voice urgent. She cut my bonds, and we slipped into the shadows of the palace. We found Thomas in a chapel, surrounded by chanting monks. He was pale, a golden chalice in his hands, his eyes glazed over. They were draining his blood. "No!" I shouted, charging forward. The monks turned, their faces twisted in fanatical rage. But we were faster, more desperate. We fought through them, reaching Thomas just as the Monsignor entered the chapel, his face contorted with fury. "You are too late," he screamed. For a moment, I saw the ritual circle on the floor, the ancient symbols glowing faintly. I knew what I had to do. I grabbed the chalice from Thomas's limp hands and dashed it against the stone floor. The blood spilled, breaking the circle. A wave of energy erupted, throwing everyone back. The Monsignor screamed in rage as the glow faded. In the chaos, we fled, dragging Thomas with us. We had stopped the ritual, but the cost was high. Thomas was weak, barely conscious. The Monsignor was still out there, and the Guardian's plan was only paused, not ended. We were running again, but now we had a new secret, a new burden. And the Monsignor would stop at nothing to finish what he started. What is the next move? What is the Guardian's final gambit? You'll have to stay tuned to find out. Subscribe and hit the bell so you don't miss the next chapter, because the end is just the beginning. We dragged Thomas through the winding back alleys of Avignon, his blood staining our hands. The city was a hornet's nest, the Monsignor's men swarming every corner. Every shadow seemed to move, every whisper felt like a shout. We couldn't go back to our quarters, couldn't risk the main gates. Alex knew a way, a smuggler's route through the old sewers that led to the docks. The stench was unbearable, but it was our only escape. As we emerged, covered in filth, we saw the city gates closing behind us, trapping the innocent inside with that madman. We had stopped the ritual, but at what cost? Thomas was fading, his breath shallow. He was the key, the last of the custodes' bloodline, and we had just painted a target on his back. We had to get him somewhere safe, somewhere the Monsignor's reach couldn't find him. But where? Every path seemed to lead back to him. We were fugitives in a world that was dying, and the only person who could save it was barely clinging to life. We found refuge in an abandoned leper colony on the outskirts of the city, a place the living feared to tread. The crumbling stone walls offered little comfort, but they offered a form of safety. Alex, ever resourceful, had brought bandages and herbs. She worked tirelessly to clean Thomas's wounds, her hands steady despite the gravity of the situation. As I watched her, a new suspicion began to form. She knew too much, moved with too much purpose. Her knowledge of the custodes, of the rituals, it was all too precise. "Who are you, really?" I asked her. She paused, her eyes meeting mine with a depth of sorrow I hadn't seen before. "I am what I always said I was," she replied, "a scholar. But my family served the custodes for generations. We were their keepers, their protectors. When they vanished, we hid, waiting for the day we'd be needed again." The pieces clicked into place. She wasn't just an ally, she was a guardian of the guardians. But that meant she knew more about the prophecy, about the bloodline, than she was telling. Thomas's fever spiked that night. His skin was clammy, his breath ragged. The blood loss was severe, and the herbs we had were not enough. Alex said he needed a specific root, one that only grew in the high mountain valleys to the north. It was a 2-day journey, a journey we couldn't afford. But without it, Thomas would die. And if he died, the Monsignor's plan would fail, but so would any hope of stopping the Guardian. I was torn. I couldn't leave Alex alone with him, but I couldn't let him die. "I'll go," I said, my voice firm. Alex protested, but I had made up my mind. I was the one who had brought him into this, and I would be the one to save him. As I prepared to leave, Thomas stirred, his eyes fluttering open. "The circle," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "It wasn't just for me. It was a map. The final ritual, it will happen in the west. At the edge of the world." His words hung in the air, a final, chilling prophecy. He was telling me where the end would begin. The journey north was a blur of fear and desperation. I pushed through the forest, my mind racing with Thomas's words. The edge of the world. What did it mean? I had heard tales of a place where the ocean met the sky, where the earth itself ended. But those were just sailors' myths, stories to frighten children. Or were they? The custodes had worshipped at the edge of the world. Their name, in the old tongue, meant the ones who watched the horizon. It was their sacred duty to guard against what lay beyond. The Monsignor knew this. He wasn't just trying to control the plague, he was trying to reach the source, to commune with the entity itself. The final ritual would be a summoning, a doorway opened wide. And Thomas, with his blood, was the key to that door. I had to find the route and get back before it was too late. But as I climbed higher, I saw it, a column of black smoke rising from the direction of the colony. My heart stopped. The Monsignor had found them. I ran back, my lungs burning, my legs screaming in protest. The colony was in ruins, the roof collapsed, flames licking at the stone walls. I searched desperately, calling their names. I found Alex behind a crumbling wall, a gash on her forehead, but alive. "Thomas," she gasped, "they took him. The Monsignor's men, they came for him." My world shattered. I had failed. I had left them, and now the boy was in the hands of that monster. "He took him west," Alex said, her voice weak. "He's going to complete the ritual. He's going to the edge of the world." We had no time to mourn, no time to plan. We had to move. The Monsignor had a head start, but he didn't know this land like Alex did. She knew a quicker route, a dangerous pass through the mountains that would cut our journey in half. It was a suicide mission, but it was our only chance. We had to reach the coast before the Monsignor could complete his dark work. We had to save Thomas and stop the end of the world. We climbed, higher and higher, the air growing thin and cold. The pass was treacherous, a narrow ledge carved into the cliff face. We moved in silence, driven by a singular purpose. As we crested the ridge, the view stole my breath. The ocean stretched out before us, an endless expanse of gray-green water. And there, on a cliff overlooking the sea, stood the Monsignor and his followers. They had formed a circle around Thomas, who was bound to a stone altar. The ancient symbols were carved into the rock, glowing with a faint, sickly light. We were too late. The ritual had begun. "What do we do?" Alex whispered, her voice trembling. I had no answer. We were two people against an army of fanatics. But I had one thing they didn't have, the knowledge of what the Monsignor truly intended. He didn't want to destroy the world, he wanted to rule it. And I knew that the entity he was trying to summon would not be so easily controlled. It would consume him, just as it would consume us all. What happens when the key is turned and the door opens to something that doesn't want to be controlled? That's the question that will define our fate. And to find the answer, you'll have to join us in the next chapter. Subscribe and hit the bell so you don't miss the conclusion, because the end is just the beginning. We stood there, frozen, watching the ritual unfold. The Monsignor's voice echoed over the roar of the sea, chanting words that twisted the air itself. Thomas's eyes found mine across the distance, wide with terror, pleading. Alex gripped my arm, her nails digging into my skin. "We can't just charge in," she hissed. "They'll kill him the moment they see us." She was right. But standing here, doing nothing, was a death sentence too. The glow around the altar was intensifying, the symbols on the stone burning brighter with each passing second. The entity was coming. I scanned the cliff, looking for any kind of advantage. There was a narrow path that snaked down the side, partially hidden by scrub brush. It led to a ledge just below the altar. It was a long shot, a suicide run. But it was the only shot we had. I looked at Alex. "Cover me." I crept along the edge of the cliff, using every bit of cover I could find. The wind whipped at my clothes, threatening to tear me from the rock. Below, the Monsignor raised his arms, his voice rising to a fever pitch. The air grew heavy, charged with a power that made my skin crawl. I was almost to the ledge when a guard spotted me. He shouted, pointing his sword in my direction. The ritual faltered for a moment as heads turned. I didn't wait. I broke into a sprint, dodging between the jagged rocks. An arrow whistled past my ear, embedding itself in the stone behind me. I dove, rolling behind the altar as a crossbow bolt clattered against the ground. I was out of time. I looked at Thomas, who was trembling, his face white as a sheet. "Stay calm," I whispered, drawing my dagger. The Monsignor's voice boomed out, "Kill him." The first guard lunged, and I sidestepped, grabbing his arm and using his momentum to send him crashing into the second. They went down in a tangle of limbs. I turned to face the Monsignor, who was watching me with a cold, amused smile. "So, the scholar returns," he said, his voice dripping with contempt. "You're too late. The key has already been turned." He gestured to Thomas, and I saw the symbols on the altar were now glowing a deep, pulsing red. The ground beneath our feet began to tremble. A low, guttural sound rose from the earth, like the growl of a great beast waking from a long sleep. The sky above the ocean darkened, and a colossal shadow began to take form in the clouds. The entity was breaking through. I had to stop it. But the Monsignor stood between me and the altar, and behind him, his followers were closing in. I had one chance. I knew the Monsignor's arrogance was his weakness. He wanted to see me broken, to witness my defeat. I let my dagger drop to the ground. "You've won," I said, my voice heavy with defeat. A smug grin spread across his face. Of course I have. I always do. He took a step closer, savoring his victory. It was the opening I needed. In one fluid motion, I grabbed a handful of loose gravel from the ground and flung it into his face. He screamed, clawing at his eyes. I lunged forward, tackling him to the ground. We wrestled in the dirt, his hands finding my throat. I was weaker, but I was desperate. I drove my knee into his stomach, and he let go with a grunt. I scrambled to my feet, but before I could reach Thomas, a searing pain exploded in my side. A guard had driven a sword into my ribs. I stumbled, falling to my knees. The world swam before my eyes. I could taste blood in my mouth. Through the haze of pain, I saw Alex emerge from the shadows, a stolen sword in her hand. She moved like a ghost, cutting down the guard who had stabbed me, then another who rushed to take his place. She stood over me, a shield against the oncoming horde. "Get up," she shouted, her voice fierce. "This isn't over." I pushed myself up, ignoring the fire in my side. The Monsignor was back on his feet, his face contorted with rage. He was shouting orders, but his followers were in chaos, caught between Alex's blade and the terrifying spectacle unfolding above us. I looked at Thomas, still bound to the altar. The red glow was now blinding, and the shadow in the sky was reaching down, a claw of pure darkness about to grasp the altar. This was the moment. I had to get to Thomas. I stumbled towards the altar, my vision blurring. The Monsignor was screaming, but his voice was drowned out by the roar of the entity. The claw was almost upon us. I reached Thomas and began sawing at the ropes binding him with my dagger. "It's okay, I've got you," I gasped. The ropes frayed and snapped. Thomas was free. I grabbed him, pulling him off the altar and shielding him with my body as the claw slammed into the stone, shattering it into 1,000 pieces. The impact sent a shockwave across the cliff, knocking everyone off their feet. The Monsignor was thrown back, his body disappearing over the edge with a scream. The shadow in the sky began to dissipate, its anchor destroyed. The ritual was broken. But as I looked at the destroyed altar, I saw a single, glowing shard of stone. It pulsed with a faint, malevolent light. The door was closed, but the lock was now in our possession. And I knew, with a chilling certainty, that this was not the end. It was a new beginning. What happens when the key to the end of the world falls into the hands of those who don't understand it? And what will the entity, denied its prize, do next? The answer to that lies in the shadows of the West, where a new power is rising. To find out, you'll have to stay with us. Subscribe and hit the bell, because the next chapter will reveal the fate of the shard, and the birth of a legend that will outlast the plague itself. The shockwave threw us all to the ground, the world a deafening roar of shattered stone and screaming wind. When I dared to open my eyes, the claw was gone. The sky was clearing, the malevolent shadow dissolving into the pale dawn. The Monsignor's scream still echoed in my ears, a final, fading note of his ambition. I scrambled to my feet, my body screaming in protest, and looked around. Alex was helping a dazed but alive Thomas to his feet. The cultists were scattering, their fanaticism broken, their leader gone. We had won. We had actually won. But as I took a shaky breath, my eyes fell on the spot where the altar had been. The center of the destruction was a small, perfectly smooth crater. And in the middle of it, pulsing with a soft, sickly light, lay a single shard of the altar stone. It was the size of my palm, and it hummed with a power that made my bones ache. The door was closed, but its key now lay in our hands. The shard was cold to the touch, yet it pulsed with a warmth that felt like a heartbeat. A heartbeat from something vast and ancient, something that was now, perhaps, aware of us. "We need to move," Alex said, her voice tight. "The Monsignor is gone, but his influence isn't. And the church will have questions." She was right. We were standing on a cliffside in the middle of nowhere, holding a piece of a cosmic weapon, with the entire power structure of the world hunting for us. I wrapped the shard in a piece of my torn cloak, feeling its malevolent energy thrum even through the fabric. Thomas, still pale and shaken, looked at it with wide eyes. "What is it?" he whispered. "I don't know," I answered, "but it's the only thing that can close the door for good." We had won the battle, but the war for the fate of this world had just taken a terrifying new turn. We couldn't go back to Avignon. We couldn't go anywhere that was known. We had to disappear, and we had to figure out what to do with the most dangerous object I had ever held. We traveled for days, avoiding roads and villages, living off the land. The shard never left my side, its cold presence a constant reminder of the burden we carried. Alex led us to a place she knew, a forgotten monastery nestled in a remote valley, abandoned for decades. It was a sanctuary, but it felt more like a prison. The silence was heavy, broken only by the wind and the distant call of birds. I spent hours studying the shard, trying to understand its nature. It wasn't stone, not truly. It was something else, something that felt both impossibly old and unervingly alive. Alex believed it was a fragment of the mechanism we had seen in Pandora, a piece of the machine that could be used to either open or close the door. But how? One night, as I was examining it by candlelight, I noticed a faint, almost invisible pattern etched onto its surface. It was a spiral, but not the broken one from the custodes. This one was complete, and at its center was a symbol I had never seen before. A symbol that looked like an eye, weeping a single tear. The symbol was a revelation, but also a curse. It confirmed that the shard was more than just a piece of the machine, it was a link to the entity itself. A link that could be used to not only close the door but to communicate. Or to be influenced. "We have to be careful, Guy," Alex warned, her face pale in the candlelight. "This thing isn't just a tool. It's alive." She was right. I could feel it in my mind, a faint whisper at the edge of my consciousness, a temptation to use its power, to understand it fully. It was a seductive thought. But I knew that path led to madness. The Monsignor had walked that path, and it had destroyed him. We decided that the only safe thing to do was to hide the shard, to bury it somewhere it could never be found. But where? It was too dangerous to keep, yet too powerful to destroy. As we debated, a sound from outside made us freeze. It was the sound of hoofbeats, echoing through the valley. We were no longer alone. I grabbed the shard, stuffing it back into my cloak, and peered through a crack in the shutters. A small group of riders was approaching the monastery gates, their banners bearing an emblem I didn't recognize. A black serpent coiled around a golden cross. We watched in stunned silence as the riders dismounted. They weren't the Monsignor's men, his forces were broken. No, these men moved with a different purpose, a cold efficiency. Their armor was polished, their swords sharp. They were the elite, and they served a master who had just learned of our survival and our prize. The leader, a tall man with a scar across his face, pounded on the heavy wooden doors. "In the name of the Holy Inquisition, open in the name of God," he bellowed. The Inquisition. They had been hunting heretics and secrets for years, and now they had found us. Alex cursed under her breath. "They must have tracked us from the cliff. They're not here to talk." We had two choices: fight our way out, or try to slip away through the monastery's old catacombs, which Alex knew about. The shard pulsed against my chest, a frantic heartbeat. The Inquisition didn't know what we had, but they knew we were important. They knew we had escaped the massacre at the altar. And they would stop at nothing to get their hands on what they thought we knew. We were cornered, and the only way out was through the dark, forgotten tunnels beneath our feet. The catacombs were a labyrinth of death, a network of tunnels lined with the bones of long-forgotten monks. It was cold, silent, and utterly dark. We moved by the faint light of a single torch, our footsteps echoing in the oppressive silence. The shard was a cold weight against my chest, its hum seeming louder in the darkness. For hours, we navigated the tunnels, hoping to find another exit. Then, we heard them, the sound of pursuit. The Inquisition had found our trail. They were close, their torches casting dancing shadows on the walls. We ran, our lungs burning, the bones of the dead rattling around us. We burst out into a hidden grove, a small circle of sunlight in the middle of the forest, just as the sun was setting. We were free, but our flight was a temporary reprieve. We had the shard, but we had no allies, no sanctuary. We were fugitives, hunted by the church, by the remnants of the Monsignor's cult, and by whatever cosmic force now knew we had its key. As we disappeared into the deepening shadows of the woods, I knew we were embarking on a new and far more dangerous journey. The plague was over, but its true war had just begun. What is the Inquisition's true purpose, and what will they do with the power they seek? And what will the entity, denied its prize, do next? That answer lies in the shadows of the West, where a new power is rising. To find out, you'll have to stay with us. Subscribe and hit the bell, because the next chapter will reveal the fate of the shard, and the birth of a legend that will outlast the plague itself.